One of the hardest parts of getting better at a craft like this is that we have no guidelines, no standards against which we can judge our progress. There are no levels or divisions or weight classes for painting. It's just us, perfection, and what feels like an enormous gulf between the two. The result is that it's easy to set ourselves up for profound disappointment when we paint, and even easier when we're repeatedly struggling to think that we struggle because we simply aren't that good. Perhaps every painting before now was just us getting lucky, but this painting, is the one that shows our true colors. Because after all, if we were that good, we'd be able to at least be that good every time we sit down to paint, right? I hear this, or unspoken versions of this, more often than not when I talk to painters. But just because it's a common refrain doesn't mean it's true. So if you've had these thoughts about your work before, I want you to keep watching. I want to talk today about disappointment with this painting of stirrups and stirrup leathers from my old dressage saddle. Not because I'm disappointed in this painting. In fact, I'm really proud of it. But I had to control a lot of variables to make sure this painting would be successful, and they are the same variables that can totally derail a painting if you aren't careful. So I'm not by nature a still life painter, but when a painter does it well, I am absolutely enthralled. It may never be what I'm known for, but I love studying these sorts of paintings and understanding what makes them so beautiful. And that's what this painting was. I wanted to reverse engineer the things that made my favorite painting so special and pay attention to any variable that may be important to that. And it led me to the variables that often sabotage our paintings and leave us wrongly feeling like lesser painters. For this painting particularly, I was inspired by some of Daniel Keyes' paintings. These still life pieces that weren't of flowers, the subject that he's known for, but instead of crayons and paints and children's toys. I've linked one of my favorites from this series below in the description. The way the objects were scattered down the canvas in these paintings felt both like a masterclass in composition as well as an indirect portrait of the child who would play with these objects. The rendering was loose, the color and light were so accurate that despite the expressive brushwork, the scene felt real, like something you'd want to reach out and touch. And I wanted to understand how that worked. How you could get your eye so attuned to the nuance of color and light that you would weave the viewer's eye in and out of the composition, and how you could evoke so much with such simple brushwork. And the more I studied, the more I understood how rarely we do this in our own work. When I looked at Daniel's piece, I realized how much of the piece was defined by the angle of the painter's eye relative to the still life. How much the temperature of the light, the colors of each object, and the placement of everything throughout the composition mattered. I realized that you couldn't achieve this with any old subject. It had to be a subject that spoke to you and told a story, just like these crayons and toys did. Before looking at this painting and analyzing it that way, when I would set up a still life, my painting went something like this. I'd pick an object, plop it down on the nearest table, pull over the light that was closest to me, and paint. Never mind the height of myself relative to the table, or the height, temperature, or strength of the light. Never mind how each of the objects related to one another or moved throughout the composition, or even how much I cared about what I was painting. I figured that if I had the skill to do it, it would look great, and it was just that simple. But for this one, I was thinking about everything. I realized Daniel's piece was framed at a pretty steep angle, so you could only see the table the crayon sat on, not the backdrop behind it. The light was cool, diffuse, and overhead. These aren't hard, raking shadows jutting out from under the objects that you see in this painting. And the crayons move thoughtfully in and out of the scene. They aren't centered or neatly contained within the frame. And when I went to do this myself, I had to make sure that I was really careful not to tighten up the piece and lose the painterly quality I was trying to capture. So putting all of these things together, when I worked on my own original composition, I worked to make sure I was doing all the same things that Daniel was doing. I picked a little swatch of carpet for the stirrups and stirrup leathers to sit on. I knew I wanted to paint something that represented something from my childhood, and that's why I chose the stirrups and the leathers. And I was careful to arrange these in a way that mimicked the composition that I had loved in Daniel's work. When it was all said and done, I probably spent more time studying and planning for this piece than I actually did painting it. And this really meshes with what I found when I've talked to Daniel myself or to other still life painters. The planning takes way more time and effort than the painting. And I find this is really what separates professionals from amateurs, is that professionals know how important the planning is and are willing to put in that time, because at the end of the day, it means it saves them a great deal of time and effort painting and guarantees a result they're going to be happy with. So I want to ask, how often do we really do this when we set up our own paintings? I found that it's a lot less often than we think. Take, for example, a situation most of us have encountered when accepting commissions. We have a potential client who would love a painting of her family, but she'd love to include relatives who are out of town, so she wants to send photos of everyone that is supposed to be in the painting. She pulls the photos off Facebook, and the best photo of her sister isn't the best photo of her dad. So suddenly we're working from 4 different photos taken from different angles and different light, and half of them are so grainy that we can't make out the person's facial details at all. And we need to make up a background that makes sense for everyone to be standing in front of. Sound familiar? If you've ever taken on a project like this, you know just how frustrating it can be. The task of working with poor reference, reconciling multiple photos, disparate lighting, or simply working on a piece that isn't especially inspiring can throw you way off your game all by themselves, let alone when you put them all together. So often we get started on a painting only to tell ourselves, I'll figure out the background later, or I'll just paint them as if the same light is on them, or sure, I can add details that this grainy photo happens to be missing. Something I tell my students often is that painting requires enough concentration all on its own without having to make these kinds of editorial decisions on top of everything else. Think about it. When we lay down a single brushstroke, we have to mix the right colors, tune it to the right value, put the brush down in the right shape, size, orientation, and in the right place on the canvas, choose the right brush to make the mark we want, and figure out how to use that brush just right to prevent the stroke from making a mess with the other paint already on the canvas. The last thing we want is to be wondering if all of that is for nothing, because really we should have just painted the subject in a blue shirt instead of a green one. The solution here is to make those kinds of decisions early. Plan your pieces so that just as you look at the composition before you, your model sitting in the chair, your still life setup, the landscape that you have stretching out in front of you, they should already look like the painting you want to make before you even begin to put brush to canvas. And if they don't, I'd ask, why do you expect to solve your problem in the middle of the painting process rather than beforehand? And this is a pretty simple example. You don't have to be working on a tricky commission to encounter this kind of problem. Oftentimes, I've found painters run into this right after a breakthrough, which is rough. They make a painting that feels like the best thing they've ever made, and then their very next piece seems like such a disappointment. And it's happened to me too. It's easy to think, once you've had that breakthrough, that you've arrived. You've overcome the big hurdles you were facing before, and now you have the skills that you need to do it over and over again. And the thing is that you do. You do have the skills. It wasn't luck that put your brush on the canvas exactly the way you needed to make your favorite painting. You did that. But everything fell into place to let you showcase your skills in that way, and that's where we tend to have a real blind spot. We don't realize that our favorite painting turned out so well because we love the subject and put them in exactly the right composition to showcase what we love about them and showcase the best bits of our style. So if you've been struggling with this, I'd ask you to reflect back on your favorite pieces. What were all of the planets that had to align to make that piece happen? What was it about the painting, your painting session, and your mood that day that could have contributed to its success? And what about for a painting that really frustrated you? Chances are you aren't giving yourself nearly as much credit, and chances are you really aren't tuned in to all of the details that made your best pieces so successful so that you can iterate on that and create paintings you're proud of over and over again the way you were hoping to. If you'd like to work with me to dig deep on the variables that set you up for success, I would love to hear from you. I have a free style guide that you can download below to get a sense of how I help painters reach their goals. And if you know you'd like to work with me, I have a link to apply for a one-on-one call with me as well down in the description box. As always, thank you for watching, subscribing, and liking this video. And until next time, happy painting.